Thank you very much. We'll now move on to oral questions put by members to ministers. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last Wednesday, our caucus shared stories from the mental health system failing Nova Scotians. And some of these stories came from the hashtag #HowManyNSHAIWK, which is an advocacy group pushing for client-centered mental health care. They presented 60 stories of Nova Scotians' experiences with the health system to directors at NSHA and IWK, and they were told that their stories would be shared with the Premier and the Minister of Health. I'd like to ask the Premier, can the Premier confirm that he has seen the 60 stories?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I have not seen those 60 stories at this time, Mr. Speaker. I look forward, though, to having a chance to review those, Mr. Speaker. I want to tell the honourable member we continue to make investments in mental health, support those families, require support. We all know early detection is an important part. That's why we're continuing to provide those wraparound services for early detection to make sure that we support families and those individuals who require support as quickly as possible.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The admin team of the HowManyNSHAIWK hashtag group hasn't heard from anyone since the meeting took place with the directors over a year ago. These are 60 stories. They're important first voice stories of people's experiences with our mental health and addiction systems. And I'd like to ask the Premier, since the members of the public that came forward with their stories were told that they would be shared with the Premier and the Minister of Health. A year's passed. He hasn't heard from those, hasn't seen the stories, hasn't heard from the group. I wonder if the Premier can just give some thoughts on what he feels about a whole entire year passing and those files being stuck to the side.
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. He would know, Mr. Speaker, Dr. Stan Kuchar, now Senator Kuchar, along with Star Dobson, who put together a panel, worked those stories. I'm sure were part of formulating the response that we had. It was very clear that the investments we need to make need to be evidence-based. Mr. Speaker, not only would those stories be part of that, but we're talking to clinicians and other healthcare providers across the province would be what would formulate the investments that we have made. I know he would know the investments we've made in the public education system in and around putting wraparound services around early detection, supports that we're providing both through health and community services to help families and those who are requiring support. We'll continue on, and I look forward to the budget being tabled on the 26th, Mr. Speaker, so we continue to build on that work that we've already been doing.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And to improve the system, we need to be listening to those that have experienced the system and those that are working in the system. I mean, the mandate of this advocacy group was very simple. They've experienced the system, they've identified the flaws, and they want to work with government to improve it. These are important first voice accounts, and they should be welcomed by this government. Who knows better what can be done to improve the system than those that have experienced it? So there's 60 stories right here in this instance. 60 people shared their experiences from their darkest moments of trying to deal with the system. They want to create change. My question for the Premier is, how many people need to fall through the cracks of this system before this government says, a year is too long, I want to hear those stories and I want to act on them?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, this is a very important issue, Mr. Speaker, that all members of this House take seriously. To suggest, Mr. Speaker, that those 60 stories wouldn't in part have been provided into the people who are making public policy is just simply unfair to Dr. Kuchar, to Star Dobson, to other members of the thing. This is a very, very serious issue that we're trying to provide supports around families. What we've done is based this on evidence, Mr. Speaker. We've heard very clearly we need to provide early detection. How do we support the wraparound services within our schools? That has come from clinicians who have listened to stories, who've been identifying and working with families and those who require support. It's why we've done the same thing, Mr. Speaker, in and around community services, providing supports in and around those families who would require that support, and we'll continue to make investments. I look forward to the table being budgeted on the 26th, but let me be clear about something, Mr. Speaker. This is evidence-based. Those stories are an important part of the journey that we're on, Mr. Speaker, as well as many other Nova Scotians and families who have come forward with their own experiences. And let me be very clear, it has helped formulate the policies in the direction of this government and those who put those policies together, Mr. Speaker, the experts.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you. Over the last decade, Mr. Speaker, in Nova Scotia, we have reduced our emissions by 6 megatons. I think we all recognize that this is the path, the trajectory that we want the province to be on. But the government has committed to reduce our emissions for the coming decade by just 1.3 megatons. Now, the IPC says that what's needed is a rapid escalation of the level of ambition about reduction of emissions. So I want to ask the Premier, does he think that a drop from 6 megatons to 1.3 qualifies as a rapid escalation of the level of ambition?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for his question. I want to thank Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians, one end of this province to the other, who continue to work alongside successive governments when it comes to the issue of reducing our greenhouse gas reduction, Mr. Speaker. We are currently at 30% above 2005 levels. We will be on track to be at least 50% below that level by 2030. We're continuing to see a decline, Mr. Speaker, in the reduction of greenhouse gas and improving of what's happening within inside of our own province. Efficiency Nova Scotia has done an outstanding job of working with communities and individual Nova Scotians and businesses to ensure that we green up our own footprints, Mr. Speaker. There are actually many stats that will tell you that the green economy in this province is going to outpace the rest of the economy as it is right now, Mr. Speaker. It's about a 5% growth in the green economy and about 2% across the rest of the economy. Those are all important signs that not only are we improving the environment, Mr. Speaker, but we're also growing the economy with it.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you. But none of this changes the fact that the IPCC report made clear that our emission reduction targets are not strong enough to avoid the costs associated with global warming above 1.5 degrees Celsius. Now, information acquired through Freedom of Information by our caucus shows that government staff recommended a more ambitious target of 50% below 2030 levels, but that the government opted for the weaker target of 45% below those levels. Will the Premier explain why his government chose a weaker emissions reduction target than was actually recommended by the government's own staff?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable member would have been in this House. He's listened to me each time, Mr. Speaker. I've never said 45%. We're on target to be below 50, Mr. Speaker. I think we can actually achieve higher, Mr. Speaker. We'll continue to make investments to help individual Nova Scotians reduce their footprint, whether it is investments in insulation programs, transitioning people new opportunities to heat their homes, all kinds of innovative ways that we're partnering with communities, businesses, and Mr. Speaker, many other organizations with Efficiency Nova Scotia to continue to use the dollars that we have to help Nova Scotia reduce the footprint, at the same time making sure that we, like all across the country, reduce our use of coal, but doing it in a way, Mr. Speaker, that doesn't shock the pocketbooks of Nova Scotians. So we're doing it in a balanced approach that is stabilizing energy prices for the first time in over a decade, and at the same time reducing our greenhouse gases and growing our economy.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you. In our province, we've been fortunate to have a framework for tripartisan support on climate action, the Environmental Goals and Sustainable Prosperity Act. And that act, when it was established, was precedent-setting and attracted attention from many places, but the Liberal government has ignored and neglected the act since that time. Under that act, there's a provision for a comprehensive review and consultation to take place every 5 years. It took place as scheduled and called for in 2012, but it didn't take place in 17, and it didn't take place in 18, and by now it's fallen 2 full years behind. I want to ask the Premier, why has his government allowed the consultation and review process for EGSPA to be ignored and neglected now for 2 full years?
The Honourable Premier.
I want to thank the honourable for the question. As he would know, that process is ongoing. I think I heard the minister yesterday was talking about that work with our partners to ensure, Mr. Speaker, that we continue to do that review. He would also know the very program he's talking about has 2 components. How do we protect the environment of the province, continue to green the economy, at the same time growing the economy, Mr. Speaker? I want to remind the honourable member we continue to reduce our greenhouse gas production in this province. Will be 50% below 2005 levels by 2030. At the same time, Mr. Speaker, as I said a few minutes ago, we're growing jobs in this province, Mr. Speaker. More young people see a future for themselves. We're seeing the green economy outpace the rest of the economy, Mr. Speaker, all in a positive way. Mr. Speaker, we got balanced budgets. We're able to invest in the economy. We'll invest in the environment. At the same time, we'll invest in our people so they see a future for themselves here.
Northside Westmount.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Health. A report in the Cape Breton Post this morning tells a story of Mr. Bill McPherson, and I'll table that report, Mr. Speaker. Mr. McPherson is from Glace Bay, and his journey brought him from housekeeper at a community hospital to medical school graduate. But because he's an international medical graduate, he can't get a local residency. He applied for a residency in Inverness, but he wasn't selected, and that residency position is still unfilled. So my question to the Minister, was he aware of Mr. McPherson's story? And if so, does he think it's fair that international medical grads struggle for residencies here when we have such a high demand for physicians?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. Pleased to take the opportunity to remind the members of the legislature that Nova Scotia recognizes the important role that residency positions play in the completion of the training for medical graduates. And indeed, Mr. Speaker, part of a national program that matches applicants to the seats, we added 10 family physician seats and 15 specialist seats, Mr. Speaker, that are part of this year's match program. So there are more opportunities, Mr. Speaker, for medical students to obtain residency positions here in the province of Nova Scotia this year.
The honourable member for Northside Westmount.
Mr. Speaker, one empty residency position, one medical school graduate looking for a medical position. Doesn't take a genius to figure out 1 + 1 = 2. It works out. I wonder if the minister can grasp the bind we're in here, Mr. Speaker. We have qualified, hard-working graduates from this province. They want to practice here, they want to grow their families here and contribute to their communities. These communities need these graduates. But as Mr. McPherson says, an international medical graduate, they're always considered lesser. Is the minister satisfied that the NSHA is doing enough to help our own international medical graduates stay and work here in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the member would know, the matching process is done nationally. The fact, Mr. Speaker, is that international medical graduates, we have, I believe, 4 positions reserved for international medical graduates in the first round of matching. Mr. Speaker, that just finished that round, as the member noted. There are some vacancies. In the second round of matching, which is underway now, international medical graduates are as eligible as any other Canadian medical school graduate. So I encourage that individual and other international medical graduates to apply for any of the vacancies, and I assure the member opposite that the member from Glace Bay has brought the concern forward. We've had the opportunity to talk and explain, Mr. Speaker, what the process is for the matching of medical students to residency positions.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Health and Wellness. Yesterday, the situation at the Dartmouth General Hospital reached a crisis level, and not for the first time. There were 23 patients without beds. 15 of them were in the emergency department, completely blocking flow to emergency care. 5 were in overflow areas, and 3 were being treated in the family lounges. People waited hours for triage. Elective surgeries were cancelled. The Dartmouth General is constantly beyond capacity and needs assistance from the NSHA and the Central Zone. The waiting room is full of people without doctors. There are no beds available for the critically ill. They are filled with patients waiting for placement in a nursing home or transfer to Halifax. Mr. Speaker, while we know that investments are being made for orthopedics and other things in the Dartmouth General, none of that is going to stem this problem. Can the minister tell the House what the NSHA is doing now to alleviate the pressure on the Dartmouth General?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the member would be aware, work, as we talked about yesterday, I believe there are questions attaching people to primary care physicians and providing primary care services is one means to improve access to care and reduce pressures on our emergency departments. That work is underway across the province, including Dartmouth. I've previously mentioned through the immigration stream, Mr. Speaker, we've had 5 family physicians commence work in the Dartmouth area, Mr. Speaker. Each of them, Mr. Speaker, that have been here since the fall are taking on full patient loads, because these are individuals, Mr. Speaker, that have several years of experience and are able to ramp up their practices very quickly. So we are, Mr. Speaker, taking the concerns seriously, and we are working to attach more people in Dartmouth and across the province to primary care services.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, with all due respect, 5 new family doctors in downtown Dartmouth Dartmouth is great. Our office have referred lots of people to them. It's a drop in the bucket for what we need, and it's not what I'm asking about. I'm asking about the Dartmouth General Hospital. Doctors and nurses at the Dartmouth General have been ingenious when it comes to solving problems. We've heard about it from the minister. We've heard about it in this House. They established an offload program to actually help ambulances get back on the road way before we've solved that in other facilities. Now that program is being expanded. They've had to do it with a catchment of over 130,000 people. 130,000 people. That's the number of people on Cape Breton Island. They're one of the largest hospitals in the province. They cannot continue to operate with 25% of their beds full of patients waiting for transfer and no added resources. Mr. Speaker, will the minister commit to finding a solution for the seniors stranded at the Dartmouth General who need long-term care and the people waiting in the emergency room?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the member would know, the infrastructure investments that are being made for the central region, the system took a broad look at this, Mr. Speaker, to identify what the long-term needs of the system for infrastructure are going to be. That plan, Mr. Speaker, was released. It identified additional beds throughout the system. Dartmouth General, as the member noted, very clearly is receiving many upgrades and expansions to services within that facility. Other aspects, Mr. Speaker, are being added to other locations. The new clinic, Mr. Speaker, expansions and the redevelopment here in Metro. But, Mr. Speaker, this is all part of the work that we recognize needs to be done to bring the system into modern state, Mr. Speaker, and provide the infrastructure for those clinicians to provide the care that all Nova Scotians require.
The honourable member for Kings North.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of TIR. Mr. Speaker, in January, the Leader of the Opposition and I attended the protest in Hansport held by the Abateau Action Group. At that time, the local MLA told the protests that a temporary fix would be in before the spring melt and that a permanent solution would follow. Well, the spring melt is now underway, and I know it's cold out, but in fact, spring weight restrictions are on, so we're in spring now. So my question for the Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal is, when will the residents of Hansport get the Abateau they were promised in January?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I really appreciate the question from the member opposite. Perhaps he could visit the site and see the busy construction site that has turned into, with a solution which has turned out to be a permanent solution that is being implemented, and we expect to have it in place and completed in the next several weeks, Mr. Speaker. I would also, Mr. Speaker, like to table a very supportive letter from the Abateau Action Group in Hansport, thanking this government for the excellent efforts they've made to restore that important piece of infrastructure.
The honourable member for Kings North.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the Minister for that answer. Mr. Speaker, the Oxford English Dictionary defines Abateau as follows, especially in the maritime province of Canada: a sluice gate in a dike which allows water draining from the land to flow out but does not allow seawater to enter, and I'll table that. This government's release stated that the fix for the breached Abateau would place 2 concrete culverts where the former wooden structures failed. At a public meeting last summer, the department staff indicated the new Abateau was estimated to cost $6 to $8 million. The difference in the estimated cost and the announced costs have people wondering just what type of structure the province is planning. So my question for the minister is this: will the people of Hansport be getting a new Abateau or simply culverts for the water to pass through?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for reminding all Nova Scotians about the tremendous ingenuity that was shown by our forebears. In the instance of the Hansport Abateau, we have records going back over 115 years, Mr. Speaker. And absolutely, the Abateau is a gate valve to hold back the tides, which of course is really a challenge. But you know, Mr. Speaker, the truth is the Hansport Abateau, the wooden culverts, had actually failed for a long period of time and were acting as a culvert. But in our foresight, we are providing a solution to equal the volume of water that was available through the wooden culverts, but with the proviso of being able to add gates to those 2 new concrete structures.
The Honourable Member for Pictou West.
Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians are rightfully fearful of the growing problems with ambulance offloads right across this province. Just yesterday, first thing in the morning, Halifax had only one ambulance available, and those responders were actually, Mr. Speaker, already in overtime. Over the course of the day, there were only 2 units available in Cumberland County. There were only 2 units available in Queens and Lunenburg. And there were 0 units available in Colchester County. And I'm sure that the Minister of Finance is deeply concerned about that. So I would like to know, does the Minister of Health believe that we have actually hit rock bottom with the chaos that we're witnessing in emergency? Or can we expect the worst yet to come?
Oh, wow. The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member for the question. Mr. Speaker, the fact of the matter is I've had our partners, the Nova Scotia Health Authority and EHS, come together to evaluate the situation, Mr. Speaker. We know that part of the challenges with ambulance availability, Mr. Speaker, relates to ambulance offloads. That is the transition from paramedics to the hospitals and the emergency department, Mr. Speaker. They've identified ways to improve that, Mr. Speaker, and they're taking action to do just that, to get those ambulances back out in the communities that they serve.
The Honourable Member for Pictou West.
Mr. Speaker, evaluation period is over. It's time to act. I know the Minister can appreciate this is the reality facing paramedics and emergency care workers in this province every single day, 24/7. Just imagine being a paramedic and not being able to tell your family when you'll be home, because if you don't put in those extra hours, you're putting other people's lives at risk. Or imagine being someone with a compromised immune system, living in fear that an ambulance will take hours when they need it the most. Will the Minister please admit that his government has failed the emergency care system so that we can start moving forward?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, reiterate to the member that, in fact, action is underway. As I indicated to the
Order,
Mr.
please.
Speaker,
the Honourable Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, Dartmouth General, as has been noted earlier today, introduced a new program to speed the transition between the ambulance to the hospital, Mr. Speaker. We're seeing progress in the Valley to implement a similar type of model, Mr. Speaker. We know, Mr. Speaker, that there's recently, within the last month or so, reports out of the Halifax Infirmary, Mr. Speaker, where the Health Authority has been focused on rapid assessment unit space that was supposed to be dedicated to the emergency department services that have been used by other services, Mr. Speaker, being reclaimed and dedicated where it should have been to help improve the situation there as well. So action, Mr. Speaker, is underway.
The Honourable Member for Northside Westmount.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is again to the Minister of Health. It has come to my attention that another doctor is closing their practice in Cape Breton. Dr. Sivakumar announced that she will be closing her ophthalmology practice this summer, and effective immediately, she will no longer accepting referrals. She serves approximately 9,000 patients, Mr. Speaker. The remaining 2 clinics are now recommending their patients seek referrals off the island. So my question to the Minister's Health, does he have a plan to ensure adequate ophthalmology services in Cape Breton?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the member would know, the Nova Scotia Health Authority's recruitment initiatives are underway, Mr. Speaker, for family physicians and specialty services, Mr. Speaker. When a vacancy comes up, Mr. Speaker, that efforts are made to fill those positions, to advertise and promote, Mr. Speaker. So, of course, that work is underway for vacancies throughout the province, whether it's ophthalmology, Mr. Speaker, family physicians, or other vacancies throughout the healthcare system. Work is underway and will continue, Mr. Speaker, as we work to fill those vacancies to ensure Nova Scotians get the care they need.
The Honourable Member for Northside Westmount.
Mr. Speaker, we had 6 ophthalmologists just a short time ago. Now we're down to 2 who are working either part-time or not taking new patients. And the Minister should have seen this coming, Mr. Speaker. More than 2.5 years ago, Dr. Siva Kumar was quoted on working conditions for the Northside doctors. And I'll table that article, Mr. Speaker. She said that doctors who were leaving cited management at the root of the problem. And she suggested that doctors should be given an anonymous exit interview. What a novel idea, Mr. Speaker. So I want to ask the Minister, when will the Minister open his eyes, admit there's a crisis in health care, and have his department or the NSHA reach out to Dr. Siva Kumar and other doctors to find out the reasons for their leaving their practices?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As we know, Mr. Speaker, people who choose to finish their careers, sometimes, Mr. Speaker, that's retirement decisions, Mr. Speaker. We know that the medical medical industry, medical services, is not the only area, Mr. Speaker, where the demographics are at a stage where people are reaching that point in their life where they would be choosing that it's time to finish their work careers and move on to the next stage of life, Mr. Speaker. That's important for those individuals who have served their communities, served Nova Scotians well, that we want to recognize that service, Mr. Speaker. But again, as has always been the case, when someone gets to that point in their career, we need to replace them. We do recruitment initiatives, Mr. Speaker, and we'll continue that work to replace those physicians, Mr. Speaker, to provide care for all Nova Scotians.
The Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question today is for the Minister of Environment. Businesses, community groups and municipalities have all called for a provincial ban on single-use plastic bags, but government is refusing to listen. The result is municipalities that want to reduce waste and protect our oceans are starting to go it alone. We're going to end up with a patchwork of regulations unless the province takes responsibility. So my question for the Minister today is, why does she refuse to implement clear province-wide standards to reduce and eliminate single-use plastic bags in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It certainly is a timely question that I appreciate from the member opposite. You know, this is something that we have discussed at broad length in our own caucus. I've talked about it in the department with department staff. We know that single-use plastic bags are 1% to 2% of the amount of what's in the solids waste stream going into landfills right now, and we know that this, there could be some solution. We're certainly working with our stakeholders. We're working with NS. Federation of Municipalities. We are speaking with them. We're speaking to other stakeholder groups, and we may have something in the future, or we may decide to put it off for a bit. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let me make it easy for the Minister. Just pass our bill. We just introduced a bill banning plastic bags across Nova Scotia, so I'll make it very easy for her. Just say yes. Just pass our bill. I think that would be a great solution. And the statistics the Minister gave of 2% actually came out before China refused to take our plastic bags, our one-use single plastics. So we need to get up to speed with those. Mr. Speaker, Montreal is doing it. PEI is doing it. Australia is doing it. Victoria is doing it. Halifax is doing it. There are jurisdictions all around the world have introduced bans. And why? Because plastic is the single biggest killer in the oceans. Now, Nova Scotia is a coastal province. We rely on clean oceans. Nova Scotians are ready to do it, but without the province, they're ready to go ahead, but without a provincial ban, it'll be slower, less effective, and more confusing. So, the time for talk is over. It's time for action. What will it take for the Minister to support a provincial ban on single-use plastic bags now?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have here a resolution from the HRM Charter that they have the authority to make bylaws for municipal purposes respecting bags, and I'll certainly table this document. Beyond that, I've certainly looked at our proposed legislation here. It is one page. Before the province goes forward with any kind of legislation, we have to make sure we do our due diligence. We have to make sure that we're talking to the stakeholders, that we're talking to the public, that we do a full consultation. And when we are ready to table any kind of a bill, Mr. Speaker, it'll be one that has substance and will work for Nova Scotia. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Sydney River, Myra, Lewisburg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question through you is to the Minister of Health. Canada has the highest rates of multiple sclerosis in the world. As a matter of fact, it's been described, excuse me, it's been described as Canada's disease. This incurable, degenerative condition impacts hundreds of thousands of Canadians, and the majority of them are women. The statistics are staggering, Mr. Speaker. For every one man diagnosed with MS, 3 women are diagnosed. And due to the symptoms of the condition, it is frequently misdiagnosed. So my question to the Minister is, what work is this government doing to help with the early identification of MS, a condition that is a condition that affects many, many women in our province?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, I sincerely want to thank the member for bringing this question about this condition to the floor of the legislature. It is a very debilitating condition, Mr. Speaker, and what I will do is I'll get some more details, but some of the information I do have off the top of my head. I know that from a research perspective, there's a program that about 18 months or maybe 2 years ago was established at Dalhousie University. I know that at St. FX University just this past fall there was a new lab that received some investment, Mr. Speaker. Some of the work being done there, I believe, does connect back with work that's being done at Dalhousie as well. So we're seeing our academic institutions that do have some clinical research being able to put things together to help further research in the space. So Nova Scotia has the opportunity. It is something, but as far as more specifics, Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to look into it a little further and get more details about what else is going on in this space.
The Honourable Member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the Minister for his answer. As the country with the world's highest MS rates, the expectation is that Canada will be a place where helps to find the cure. 80% of the people living with MS are unemployed because of the way the disease attacks their body, leaving them unable to work. Mr. Speaker, this is especially troubling for mothers who are responsible for caring for their children and find themselves unable to do so because of their illness. Research is the only way to beat this disease. This is not a record we as Canadians should be proud of. Mr. Speaker, is this government going to keep working to stop the rise of Nova Scotians having MS?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, I really sincerely do, both personally and professionally, thank the member for bringing this to the floor. And again, it is a condition that hits home to many members. I know of at least 2 of us that have family members, Mr. Speaker, in this legislature that do have family members with MS. Mr. Speaker, at various stages, we know how close and how quickly it can hit home. So, of course, we're committed to continue that research. We know we rely on the many fantastic clinical and academic researchers that we have across this province to do that, and I'm looking forward to seeing the work at Dalhousie, St. FX, and our other institutions coming together, collaborating along with our clinicians to come up with, and hopefully it is the cure coming out of Nova Scotia. It would be fantastic. We certainly have the researchers and the human capacity to do so.
The Honourable Member for Queens Shelburne.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Health. It was only a year ago that midwives on the South Shore marched on MLA offices demanding more supports. Now the fight is in northern Nova Scotia, where on December 22nd, expectant mothers were told midwife services they had been relying on at St. Martha's were being suspended. Between the ongoing issues retaining midwives and the cancelling of government-run prenatal classes, this government is making it very difficult to have a baby in this province. Could the minister please advise if there is any collaboration happening with the Association of Nova Scotia Midwives to ensure proper supports are in place for midwives?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What I can advise the member is certainly we recognized the challenges that presented themselves about this time last year. We took the initiative, the action, Mr. Speaker, hearing from both the association and midwives that having only 2 members available in a community was not sufficient to maintain the services if one was off on leave for any reason, which is what happened last year. So we added additional resources. We increased the number of positions and recruited to fill those positions, not just in the South Shore region, Mr. Speaker, but also in Antigonish, in the Eastern Zone, which has another site, and in the city we've added a position. Unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, with multiple leaves coming together at the same time, the third position was not sufficient at that time, but we continue to work to stabilize and provide these services.
The honourable member for Queens, Shelburne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Association of Nova Scotia Midwives are saying that there's a lack of understanding of what midwifery is and how it should be implemented. It's at the root of the staffing issues at St. Martha's. A midwife came to Antigonish to pursue an opportunity and left only 2 months later. A 2011 report said midwifery in Nova Scotia could not survive at its current state. Well, Mr. Speaker, it's 8 years later and we're on the brink of collapse. My question to the minister is, what is being done right now to save the midwifery program in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, the first priority is to stabilize those sites that we do have, fill those vacancies, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that the services that have been established and committed to need to be stabilized and secured, Mr. Speaker. As part of that, the next step, Mr. Speaker, would be looking at potential for further expansion. But, Mr. Speaker, we do need to ensure that we have the stabilization of those services in the communities for which the services are being offered, and again, that recruitment and those efforts are underway.
The honourable member for Pictou Centre.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Health. Mr. Speaker, in our roles as elected officials, we are all aware of the importance of confidentiality as we deal with our constituents. In our constituency office, as in most, we have signed authorization forms signed by those individuals wishing our assistance on their behalf. These forms permit MLAs to share and gather information that might otherwise be only released to that individual, and they allow us to work with few difficulties. That does not seem to be the case for continuing care in some of their offices. My question, is the Minister aware that even with signed authorization, continuing care refuses to do more than make general comments?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To answer the question, I'm not aware of that in a broad context. Certainly there have been a couple of instances. I believe the member's colleague has from Barrington? Argyle Barrington, Mr. Speaker, did raise concerns in that community, but it's not a widespread issue or concern that I'm aware of. But again, we work to educate and ensure people know what the right processes that should be followed.
The honourable member for Pictou Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this agency refuses to acknowledge the direction of the constituents' wishes to have an issue handled by someone on their behalf. Most agencies are very accommodating. In my office, we have had constituents request our assistance, and during our efforts, we are advised by the agency supervisor that they could not share particular information even after the authorization. Privacy and confidentiality are very important, but so is the ability of all of us to assist our constituents. So my question to the Minister, could the Minister look into this matter and find out why this agency will not follow protocol that is followed by most agencies?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I certainly will do that. We'll connect. I'll get the specific details from the member offline. But, Mr. Speaker, as I said at the beginning, by and large, we do see people following the processes and ensuring that they get the information to the people that the residents or their clients or substitute decision makers are looking to have that information brought to. I was only aware of one other instance where that was brought up as a concern, but if the member is raising it, we'll dig in to that and get that rectified.
The honourable member for Halifax Needham.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister responsible for Housing Nova Scotia. I was distressed and frustrated this winter to learn of a woman who is underhoused and vulnerable and unable to access support in housing because of Metro Regional Housing Authority's policy on arrears. This woman has a debt to a housing authority from 20 years ago, and that policy requires that she make a payment on that debt, which she cannot afford to do before she can even get on the wait list. As a result, she remains vulnerable and in unstable housing. And this story is not unique. Mr. Speaker, does the minister think it is right that someone should be blocked from housing support because of a decades-old debt?
The Honourable Minister responsible for Housing, Nova Scotia.
I want to thank the honourable member for bringing this question to the floor of the House. What she and her constituent should know is that all they have to do is make a very, very tiny payment. It could be $5 or $2 or whatever, but make arrangements. They just have to deal with it and they can get on the housing wait list. Thank you.
The honourable member for Halifax Needham.
Mr. Speaker, indeed, my understanding is that once a tenant is in housing, there can be a payment arrangement with a tiny payment each month. However, I spoke yesterday with a frontline social worker who is supporting an individual who needs housing, and in order to get on the wait list, he has to pay $480 on a 30-year-old debt of $600. So this is not working across the system, and I want the minister to please undertake a review across the system so that there are fair policies in all housing authorities.
The Honourable Minister responsible for Housing, Nova Scotia.
Again, I want to thank the honourable member for bringing this matter to my attention, and I want to assure her that we'll be dealing with it. Thank you.
The honourable member for Argyll-Barrington.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. In order for a modern hospital to operate, it needs a number of special doctors, surgeons, radiologists, anesthetists. Yarmouth has a rotation of 4 doctors that can provide the service so that surgeries and procedures can be done at our regional hospital. But only 3 doctors were providing the service, and 2 are leaving. And 1, I hear, is set to retire. So my question to the Minister of Health: what is the Health Authority doing to recruit, or at least provide help to the remaining anesthetists?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, as with other vacancies, the Health Authority recruitment efforts are ongoing. I can, as I understand it, advise the member that it's my understanding that there is a new recruit identified to start, I believe, on April 1st to help in the situation. And I can also assure the member opposite that the leadership team, physician leadership team at the site in Yarmouth, at Yarmouth Regional, have taken this situation seriously. They've contacted their colleagues in other parts of the province, and I've been assured, they've been assured that other regions will provide support to Yarmouth as the recruitment efforts continue and they fill those vacancies.
The honourable member for Argyll-Barrington.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, the Yarmouth Regional Hospital is very important for our area, especially with the constant closures at Roseway and a lot of Digby as well. And quite honestly, it could be one of the solutions for the problem that we're seeing of the long surgery wait lists at the hospital in the Valley, the Kenville Hospital. So my question is, how are we going to preserve surgeries in Yarmouth if we're unable to recruit or even fill that full rotation of 4 anesthetists?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd certainly agree, and I think my colleague, the member for Yarmouth, would agree as well. Having been to the Yarmouth Regional on a number of occasions, it is a fantastic facility with a lot of great staff there, providing great services to the region. Mr. Speaker, as I'd indicated, the leadership team there, including the physician leadership team, have taken the concerns and the situation seriously. They've connected with their colleagues to ensure that they do have the support, and I'm pleased that their colleagues within, and this is one of the advantages of having a provincial health authority, Mr. Speaker, that they're able to lean on the services and the availability of specialists in other parts of the province to backfill and support while recruitment positions get fulfilled.
The honourable member for Pictou West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Transportation. Time and time again, my colleagues and myself from Pictou County have asked the Minister questions with regards to the Trenton Connector, which is located in Pictou West but borders on Pictou East and Pictou Centre. And this is a very dangerous intersection. And in the fall of 2018, I asked the Minister to provide an update on the future of a roundabout being built there. And his answer was that he actually had a chance to visit that location and that his department was actually in reviewing the information and the traffic study that was presented to him. So I'm wondering if the Minister can give me an update with regards to further improvements at this location.
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I really appreciate the question from the member opposite. In our department, of course, safety is paramount, and in this particular instance, we are reviewing that particular intersection. No decision has been made at this point in terms of what the way forward is, but it's certainly on our radar, and I'd be more than happy to share the progress with the member whenever she's available.
The Honourable Member for Pictou West.
So it's disheartening that you're still reviewing it and that there's been no consideration given to a roundabout. We are patiently waiting. We recently had a meeting with over 75 people that included municipal councillors, RCMP, paramedics, firefighters, etc. This intersection actually was the cause of 5 deaths. 5 deaths. And we don't want to see a 6th. So although I can appreciate it does take time, it takes money to build a roundabout, which is what we're requesting, I would ask that the Minister commit today to lowering the speed limit from 80 to 50 in that area so that we don't have to witness that 6th death.
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the information provided by the member. I was unaware of the public meeting, and I'm not sure if we had any staff there or not. It would be unfortunate if we weren't included in the process. And if they were there, I'll find out who they were and what the actual situation is, because 1 death in Nova Scotia is too many for our program. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
Oh, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, my question through you is to the Minister of Health. As is known, the government announced that it would close both the Northside General Hospital and the New Waterford Consolidated Hospital in Cape Breton. Government has also promised to expand the Glace Bay Hospital and the Cape Breton Regional Hospital. But, Mr. Speaker, the Glace Bay Regional ER has already been closed most of 2019. In fact, it has been closed so that they can use the doctors to keep the regional hospital open. Now, Mr. Speaker, Cape Breton already suffers from a shortage of skilled physicians, and expanding infrastructure without addressing the human resource piece will only heighten the need for more skilled physicians without actually addressing the major problem. So, Mr. Speaker, the question for the Minister is simple. How will the Minister address the desperate need for physicians and specialists for these Cape Breton hospitals?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I've previously indicated, we have been engaged to understand what types of programs. We have incentive programs that the department provides to support physicians for a commitment of return of service. We provide some compensation, whether it's tuition relief, Mr. Speaker, or opportunities to help offset other debt for setting up their practices in order for a commitment to return of service. We've made changes, Mr. Speaker, to various incentives for short-term filling of positions, the locum programs, Mr. Speaker, including ED department shifts. And, Mr. Speaker, we anticipate, of course, that the infrastructure itself will help as the overall plan for the entire region is implemented, Mr. Speaker, and the physicians in the region are providing services at the 2 hospitals and 2 primary care centres.
The Honourable Member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
Well, thank you very much for that explanation about build it and they will come. I think they call that the field of dreams, Mr. Speaker. As I stated, this minister stands up time after time in this House telling us about all the incentives. We've asked a simple question, Mr. Speaker, on more than one occasion. How many doctors have left?
20 just did.
20 were ready to go. We had a resignation last night of a very skilled specialist, going from a department that had 6 now to 1 person, 2 people. Mr. Speaker, when in the world will this minister finally tell the people of Cape Breton how bad the situation is? There are doctors leaving daily. There is no plan in place to bring doctors into our community. We're going to build big buildings. Well, maybe the plan is, Mr. Speaker, they're going to make it long-term care beds, because we don't have any of them either. Mr. Speaker, when is this minister going to realize that infrastructure
Time allotted for oral questions put by